The auction block smelled of wet iron and despair. Sable kept her eyes on the ground because that was the rule. Eyes down, mouth shut, spine straight. The man holding the rope attached to her wrists had told her that much before they dragged her out of the wagon. He had breath like sour grain and a grip that left marks on her upper arms. "Lot 14, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the crowd with the bored efficiency of a man selling livestock. Female, 22 summers. No pack affiliation. Adequate health, strong teeth, good for fieldwork or household labor. Adequate health, strong teeth. Like she was a mule. The crowd murmured. Sable could feel their eyes on her, dozens of gazes crawling over her skin like insects. She wore a rough linen shift that hung past her knees, her feet bare against the wooden platform, her dark hair tangled from days in the transport cage. She looked like what she was. Property. Starting bid, 40 silvers, the auctioneer announced. A hand went up somewhere to the left, then another to the right. The numbers climbed in dull, mechanical increments. 45, 50, 55. Each bid landed like a stone in her stomach. She had been sold before, twice. The first time she was 9 years old and too young to understand what was happening. The second time she was 16 and understood perfectly. Neither experience had prepared her for the third, because understanding did not make it easier. It just meant she knew exactly what came next. 60 silvers, a rough voice called from the back. Sable's gaze stayed fixed on the warped planks beneath her feet. A knot in the wood stared back at her like a dead eye. She counted the splinters radiating from its center. 7. She counted them again. Still 7. 65. 70. The bidding was getting competitive, which meant she would go to someone with money, which meant a noble house, or a pack compound. Noble houses were survivable. Pack compounds were unpredictable. 75 silvers, final call? Then a new voice cut through the noise. Low, calm, and carrying an authority that silenced the crowd like a hand pressed over a screaming mouth. 200. The silence that followed was absolute. Sable's head snapped up on instinct, the rule about eyes down obliterated by shock. 200 silvers was not a bid for a servant. 200 silvers was a bid for a statement. The crowd parted and she saw him. He stood at the back of the square, flanked by 2 men in dark leather armor bearing the silver fang crest of the Valdrin pack. He was tall, absurdly tall, with broad shoulders that blocked out the merchant stall behind him. Dark hair fell across a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then struck by lightning. All sharp angles and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. His eyes were the color of forge smoke, pale gray, almost silver, and they were locked onto her with an intensity that made her lungs forget how to work. Sable had never seen him before, but she knew who he was. Everyone knew. The scar, the crest. The way the air in the square seemed to bend around him like even the wind knew better than to touch him without permission. Theron Valdrin, alpha of the Valdrin pack, the Pale Wolf, the man who had united 3 warring territories through a combination of strategy, brute force, and a reputation so terrifying that enemy packs surrendered at the sight of his banner. He was looking at her like she had just set fire to something he owned. "Sold!" the auctioneer stammered, recovering too quickly and slamming his gavel down before anyone could blink. Lot 14, sold to the Valdrin delegation for 200 silvers. The rope around her wrists was passed to one of the armored men, who took it with a grim expression and gestured for her to step down from the platform. Sable's legs moved on their own. Her mind had gone blank, white noise and static, and the unshakable feeling that something monumental had just shifted beneath her feet. As they led her past Theron Valdrin, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, he inhaled sharply through his nose. His entire body went rigid. Those smoke-colored eyes widened, then narrowed, then locked onto her with something that looked dangerously close to recognition. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jump beneath the scar, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. Sable was shoved forward before she could process what she had just seen on the face of the most feared alpha in the realm. It looked like panic. The Valdrin compound sat in the throat of a mountain valley, a sprawling complex of stone and timber that looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had swallowed a village. Guard towers rose at each corner. The outer wall was 20 feet of mortared granite. Beyond it, the buildings clustered tight. A great hall at the center, barracks to the north, storehouses and workshops lining the south corridor, and rows of modest dwellings for the lower-ranked wolves spreading east. Sable saw none of this when she arrived. She saw the inside of a storage room. "You sleep here," said Marin, the head of household, a compact woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to stretch her eyebrows upward into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. She pointed at a narrow cot wedged between shelving units stacked with folded linens. "You eat in the kitchen after the household has been served. You speak when spoken to. You do not enter the Great Hall, the Alpha's quarters, or the East Wing under any circumstances. Clear?" "Clear," Sable said. Marin studied her for a long moment, her gaze clinical. "You have a trade?" "Herbcraft," Sable replied. "Tinctures, salves, wound treatment. I apprenticed with a field healer in the border settlements before I was—" She stopped. "Before I was taken." The words sat in her mouth like a stone. She swallowed them. "Before," Marin finished for her, not unkindly. "The pack has a healer. Old Brennick. He could use a second pair of hands. I will speak to him in the morning." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "One more thing. The Alpha is not to be approached. Not by you. Not ever. If you see him in the corridor, you step aside and lower your gaze. If he enters a room you are in, you leave. Understood?" "Understood," Sable said, though the instruction struck her as oddly specific. Servants avoided the Alpha as a general rule, the way small animals avoided large predators. Instinct, not policy. Making it an explicit order suggested something else entirely. Marin left. Sable sat on the cot in the room that smelled of cedar and dust and tried to convince herself that this was survivable. Worse things had happened to her before. She would survive this. She did not think about the way Theron Valdrin had looked at her in the square. She did not think about the way his nostrils had flared, or the way his fists had clenched, or the expression on his face that she could not name. She absolutely did not think about it. The first 3 days passed in a blur of labor and routine. Sable scrubbed floors, hauled water, folded linens, peeled root vegetables until her fingers cramped, and learned the geography of the compound through sheer repetition. Brennick, the pack healer, was 70, reed thin, and possessed the conversational warmth of a slate roof. He communicated in grunts, pointed at things he wanted done, and occasionally muttered observations about Sable's technique that might have been compliments if delivered in any tone other than vague irritation. "Your poultice work is acceptable," he said on the second day, which Marin later told her was the highest praise he had given a living person in 6 years. Sable kept her head down. She did not ask questions. She did not see the Alpha. Not once in 3 days. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Sable was in the herb garden, cutting stalks of silvervein for Brennick's arthritis tincture, when the door to the workshop banged open and Marin appeared, slightly breathless in a way that Sable had never seen from the woman. "Leave that," Marin said. "Come with me. Now." Marin walked fast, leading Sable through corridors she had never entered, past the great hall, up a stone staircase, and into the East Wing. The one she had been told never to enter. They stopped outside a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. 2 guards stood on either side, and between them, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, was a man Sable had not met, but had heard about. Dashel, the Alpha's second, his right hand, his strategist. Lean, sharp-featured, with watchful dark eyes that took her apart and reassembled her in the span of a single glance. "This is her?" Dashel asked Marin. "This is her," Marin confirmed. Dashel opened the door. The room beyond was large, well-appointed, and dominated by a desk buried under maps and correspondence. The fire had burned low, casting the space in amber and shadow. And in the chair behind the desk, slumped forward with his head resting on his folded arms, was Theron Valdrin. Asleep. "He collapsed 20 minutes ago," Dashel said quietly from behind her. "He has not slept in 4 days." Sable turned to look at him. 4 days? Dashel's expression was carved from the same stone as the compound walls. "The Alpha does not sleep. Not properly. Not for more than a handful of minutes before something wakes him. It has been this way for months. But this morning he walked into his study, sat down at his desk, and was unconscious within 10 minutes. He paused. 10 minutes after you began working in the herb garden directly below his window." The implication landed like a fist to the sternum. "You think I did this?" Sable said. "I think you were within proximity and he slept for the first time in 4 days," Dashel replied evenly. "I think that is not a coincidence." Sable looked back at the sleeping Alpha. His face, stripped of its waking severity, looked younger than she had expected. The scar was still brutal, but the hard line of his mouth had softened, and the tension that lived permanently in his jaw had released. He looked human, vulnerable, exhausted in a way that went deeper than missed sleep. "What do you want me to do?" Sable asked. "Stay," Dashel said. "Sit in that chair by the wall and do not move until he wakes. When he wakes, you say nothing about this to anyone, and tonight, you will be moved to a room adjacent to the Alpha's chambers." "This is not a request," Dashel added when she opened her mouth. His voice was quiet, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "This is an order from the Alpha's second, acting in the interest of the Alpha's survival." Sable sat. She watched the most dangerous man she had ever encountered sleep like a child at his desk, and felt the first cold tendril of a fear she could not name wrap itself around the base of her spine. Not fear of him. Fear of whatever was about to happen to her life. Theron Valdrin slept for 3 hours. When he woke, his pale gray eyes found her immediately, like he had known exactly where she was even unconscious. He stared at her for 5 full seconds without speaking. Then he looked at Dashel, who stood by the door. "Get her out," the Alpha said, his voice raw and rough with sleep. Sable was escorted from the room before she could draw another breath. But that night, just as Dashel had promised, her cot was moved from the storage room to a small chamber separated from the Alpha's quarters by a single wall. And through that wall, for the first time in months, she heard the sound of a man sleeping through the night. Sable did not sleep well that first night in her new room. The wall between her chamber and the Alpha's quarters was thick stone, but she could still sense him on the other side. Not words, not sounds exactly, just the quality of silence, the deep, heavy stillness of a body that had finally surrendered to rest. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning. None of this made sense. Servants did not get moved to the residential wing. Servants did not get private rooms adjacent to the Alpha's chambers. Servants did not get studied by the Alpha's second like a specimen under glass. By morning, she had slept perhaps 2 hours. Marin arrived with a breakfast tray and an expression that suggested she had opinions about this entire arrangement. "He slept 8 hours, Marin said, setting the tray down. 8. Brennick says he has not managed more than 40 minutes uninterrupted since midsummer." Sable stared at the tray, Bread, butter, sliced pear, a cup of broth. Servant meals were porridge and water. This was household food. Eat, Marin said, noticing her hesitation. You are not in the storage room anymore. Different rules apply. The first week established a pattern. During the day, Sable worked with Brennick in the herb workshop. At night, she returned to her chamber and lay in the dark. He slept. Every night. As long as she was on the other side of that wall, the Alpha slept. Dashiell appeared on the third day and escorted her to a small sitting room. He closed the door and stood with his back to it, arms crossed. The Alpha wants you moved farther away, Dashiell said. I thought you wanted me close. I do. He does not. Dashiell's jaw tightened. He says it is inappropriate for a servant to be housed in the residential wing. He says it invites gossip. And you disagree, Sable said carefully. The Alpha has not slept properly in 5 months, Dashiell said, his composure cracking just enough for her to see the exhaustion beneath it. During that time, I have watched him deteriorate from the strongest wolf I have ever known into a man who cannot hold a quill steady past midday. I have watched him nearly injure a sparring partner because his reflexes are fraying. He paused. So yes, I disagree. He will find out I stayed, Sable said. He already knows. He is choosing not to fight me on it because he knows I am right. He simply does not want to admit it. Dashiell's mouth thinned. The man would rather die on his feet than accept help from anyone. It is his most infuriating quality, and he has many. A sound that might have been a laugh escaped Sable's throat before she could stop it. Something almost warm flickered behind Dashiell's eyes. She stayed. The days bled into one another. Brennick's workshop became her refuge, the one place where she could lose herself in work that made sense. The old healer warmed to her incrementally, his grunts evolving into short sentences and, on one memorable afternoon, an entire anecdote about a wolf who had once tried to treat his own broken leg with tree sap and optimism. Died? Sable asked. Worse, Brennick said. Survived. Now he is on the Elder Council and makes decisions for the rest of us. It took her a moment to realize he was joking. Another moment to realize this was the first time she had laughed in months. But the nights were a different thing entirely. She could sense him through the stone. A presence, a warmth that had no physical source. She would lie in the dark and feel the moment he entered his chambers. The weight of him settling into the space like gravity rearranging itself. And then, slowly, the tension would ease, and she would sense him drift under. It was intimate in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, this invisible thread of awareness connecting them through stone and silence. His deep sleep was obvious to her. His restless nights registered too. And the exact moment he woke each morning announced itself, because something in her own body shifted, a tightening, as though part of her had been resting alongside him and was now being pulled back. She told herself it was proximity. She told herself a dozen rational explanations and believed none of them. On the 9th night, someone knocked on her door after midnight. Sable opened it to find Dashiell, and behind him, 2 guards carrying a man between them. Theron was conscious but barely. His face was ashen, his eyes glassy, and he was clutching his left side where a dark stain had spread across his shirt. Border skirmish, Dashiell said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Brennick is treating the others. The Alpha refuses to let anyone else touch him. So you brought him to the servant herbalist, Sable said flatly. I brought him to the only person in this compound he has slept near in months, Dashiell corrected. He trusts your scent, even if he will not admit it. He might let you close enough to treat the wound. They laid Theron on her cot. The wound was deep, a gash across his ribs, but it had missed anything vital. Painful, messy, but survivable if she could clean it and close it quickly. I need hot water, needle and thread from Brennick's kit. Yarrow paste and clean linen, she said to Dashiell without looking up. Now. Sable knelt beside the cot and examined the wound. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at the ceiling. His breath came in shallow, controlled pulls, the breathing of a man who was intimately familiar with pain and had long ago learned to manage it silently. You, he said, and his voice was a wreck, rough and frayed and barely above a whisper. Me, Sable confirmed. I am going to stitch this closed, and it is going to hurt, and you are going to let me, because the alternative is ruining my only set of sheets. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but his body, which had been rigid with tension and resistance, eased fractionally beneath her hands. The supplies arrived. Sable worked quickly and precisely, cleaning the wound, packing it with yarrow paste, stitching the deepest section with small, even sutures, while Theron lay motionless beneath her hands. He watched her work with those unreadable eyes, and she pretended that the intensity of his gaze did not make her hands want to shake. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. Done, she said. Do not tear the stitches. Dashiell, Theron said, still looking at her. Leave us. The door closed. They were alone. Why did you buy me? Sable asked before she could stop herself. Theron was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he would not answer. Because when I walked through that square, he said finally, his voice low and stripped of every defense. Your scent hit me from 30 paces, and my wolf surged forward so hard I could barely hold him back in front of 300 people. Sable stopped breathing. I did not buy you for labor, he said. I bought you because if anyone else had taken you out of that square, I would have torn apart the realm to get you back, and I did not trust myself to explain why. The silence that followed was so thick she could feel it pressing against her eardrums. Then his eyes closed, his breathing deepened. His hand, which had been gripping the edge of the cot, went slack. He was asleep. 3 inches from her, on her cot. With her scent soaked into the pillow beneath his head, and her hands still trembling from the work. Sable knelt beside him, his confession ringing in her skull, and realized with a terror that went all the way to the marrow of her bones that she had no idea what she was supposed to do with any of this. She did not sleep. She sat on the floor beside the cot with her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest, listening to Theron breathe. Deep, even, steady breaths, the kind that belonged to a man experiencing real rest for the first time in months, and she sat 2 feet away vibrating with a panic so intense it bordered on nausea. His wolf had surged forward so hard he could barely hold him back. Her scent, 30 paces. She knew what that meant. Every wolf, even a packless, twice-sold servant wolf whose own beast had been silent since childhood, knew what that meant. Mate. The word sat in her mind like a lit fuse, bright and dangerous and impossible to look away from. She turned it over, examined it, tried to find the angle from which it made sense and could not. Mates were for people who had lives, who had names that meant something, who existed in the world as more than inventory on an auction ledger. She was lot 14. She had been property since she was 9 years old. Her wolf had not stirred in over a decade, buried so deep under years of survival and silence that she had half convinced herself it was dead. And the alpha of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories was claiming she was his mate. No, he had not claimed anything. He had confessed something, raw and involuntary, dragged out of him by pain and proximity, and whatever strange alchemy her presence worked on his battered body. A confession was not a claim. A confession could be taken back. Dawn came slowly. The room filled with gray light, and Theron's breathing changed. She sensed it before she heard it, that subtle tightening in her own body, the invisible thread between them drawing taut as consciousness pulled him back. His eyes opened. For a moment, he was unguarded, blinking in the pale light, his face soft with sleep and confusion. Then he saw her sitting on the floor, and everything shuttered closed. He sat up too quickly. Pain flashed across his face as the movement pulled at his stitches, and his hand went to his side. "Careful," Sable said automatically. "You will tear them." The memory of what he had told her hung between them like smoke, visible to both, acknowledged by neither. "What I said last night," he began. "You are in pain," Sable offered quickly, giving him the exit. "People say things when they are hurt. It does not have to mean anything." His jaw tightened. Something flickered behind his eyes, and he nodded once. "I will have Deschelles arrange for you to return to your previous quarters," he said. "The storage room that is on the opposite end of the compound from your chambers." "Yes." "The storage room where, if I sleep there, you will go back to not sleeping at all." He did not answer. "Permission to speak freely," Sable said, surprising herself. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Granted. You have not slept in 5 months. Your second is terrified you are going to die. Your reflexes are compromised. Your judgment is suffering. And you have an entire pack depending on you to function. The only thing standing between you and total collapse is the servant you bought at auction sleeping within proximity of you." She paused. "Moving me back is not practical. It is pride." The silence that followed was cavernous. Theron stared at her with an expression she could not read, and for a terrible, suspended moment, she was certain she had gone too far. A servant, lecturing an alpha. In some packs, that was enough to earn a beating. "You are either very brave or very stupid," he said finally. "I have been told it is difficult to distinguish between the two," Sable replied, her heart hammering. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not exactly, but a loosening, a release of pressure, like a valve being turned on a pipe that had been building toward rupture. "You stay in the room adjacent to mine," he said. "But you do not speak of this arrangement to anyone." He left without another word, and Sable sank onto the cot that still carried his scent, pine and iron and something underneath that she could not name, and felt her wolf, her quiet, supposedly dead wolf, stir for the first time in over a decade. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. She worked with Brennick during the daylight hours, and at night, she slept in her chamber beside the Alpha's quarters. Their paths did not cross during the day. He governed. She ground herbs. 2 separate orbits that never intersected except through stone and silence. Until the afternoon, Brennick sent her to deliver a pain tincture to the training yard. She found the Alpha mid-sparring, moving with a predatory grace that made her forget why she was standing there. The wound at his side had closed to a dark, healing line, and despite weeks of broken sleep, his movements were fluid and devastating. Theron caught his opponent with a sweep that sent the bigger man crashing into the dirt. He straightened, breathing hard, and turned toward the water barrel. His eyes found her instantly. The world narrowed. Everything else, the watching wolves, the dust, the noise, fell away. He stood 20 feet from her, breathing hard, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach drop and her skin flush. Neither of them moved. Then his nostrils flared. She saw his chest expand as he drew her scent across 20 feet of open air, and his entire body went rigid. The expression that crossed his face was raw and unguarded and devastating. Hunger and recognition and a desperate, furious resistance to both. He turned away deliberately, picked up his shirt, and walked toward the barracks without looking back. Sable stood in the training yard, the tincture bottle shaking in her grip, and understood with perfect, horrible clarity that whatever was happening between them was not going to stay behind the wall much longer. That night, through the stone, she heard him pacing, back and forth, restless and awake, and fighting something that pulled at her own ribs like a hook buried deep. He did not sleep until almost dawn. and neither did she. It started with small things. A second blanket appeared on her cot one evening. Thick wool dyed a deep forest green, far too fine for a servant's quarters. Sable ran her fingers across the weave and said nothing. The next morning, the breakfast tray included honeycomb alongside the bread, a luxury she had not tasted since childhood. She ate it slowly, letting the sweetness dissolve on her tongue, and pretended her body did not ache with something dangerously close to gratitude. Then the candles. Beeswax, not tallow. The kind that burned clean and golden instead of smoking and sputtering. They appeared on her bedside table without explanation. When she mentioned it to Marin, the older woman gave her a look so carefully blank it might as well have been a confession. "I did not place them," Marin said, and walked away. Sable knew who had placed them. The knowing made her feel like she was standing at the edge of something very high with no railing. 2 weeks had passed since the night he bled on her sheets. 2 weeks of silence, of separate orbits, of sensing him through the wall every night like a tide she could not stop tracking. Her wolf was no longer silent. That was the part that frightened her most. Since childhood, the animal inside her had been a ghost, a faint presence she could barely detect, buried under layers of suppression and survival. Wolves who were sold young often lost connection with their beasts. The trauma severed something essential, and it rarely grew back. But hers was growing back. A low vibration beneath her skin, a sharpening of senses she had learned to live without. Scents were brighter. Sounds carried farther. And Theron's presence had become something she could track across the entire compound. When he entered the great hall 3 corridors away, she sensed it. When his mood shifted, something inside her answered. Brennick noticed. One afternoon, while Sable was grinding comfrey root with more force than necessary, he set down his mortar and fixed her with a look that could have pinned a moth to a board. "Your wolf is waking," he said. Sable's hand stilled. "I do not know what you mean." "You ground that root into powder 4 minutes ago. You have been pulverizing dust for the last 2. Your hands are shaking, your pupils are dilated, and you have checked the door 3 times since I sat down." He folded his arms. "Whose scent are you tracking?" She set the pestle down carefully. "It does not matter." "It matters a great deal if the wolf waking inside you is responding to a bond," Brennick said, his voice grave. "When a wolf who cannot sleep finds rest only in the presence of one specific person, it is not herbcraft. It is not coincidence. It is recognition." Sable's throat tightened. "He has not claimed me." "No, he would not. Not while you are bound to his household as property. The man has enough honor for that at least." Something flickered behind Brennick's eyes, something almost like respect. "But honor will not stop what is building between you. It will only delay it until the pressure becomes unbearable." That evening, Sable returned to her chamber and found the door to the Alpha's quarters standing open. In 2 weeks, that door had never been open. The inside of his rooms was unknown to her. Now there was a rectangle of warm amber light spilling across the stone corridor, and through it, she could see the edge of a heavy oak desk and the corner of a map pinned to the wall. She should have walked into her own room and closed the door. Instead, she stepped into the doorway. Theron stood by the window, his back to her, his hands braced against the stone sill like he was holding himself upright through force of will. The firelight caught the scar on his temple, turning it to a line of liquid gold. "You left your door open," Sable said. He did not turn around. "I know." "Why?" "Because I am tired of pretending I do not know you are on the other side of that wall," he said, his voice low and rough and stripped of every pretense. "Because I can sense you there every night, and it is driving me slowly and completely insane." "You can sense me?" He turned then, and the look on his face nearly undid her. Raw. Open. A fortress with its gates torn off the hinges. "Every breath," he said. "Every shift. every heartbeat. I know when you fall asleep. I know when you wake. I know when you dream because your breathing changes, and my wolf. He stopped, his jaw clenching shut. Sable stepped into the room. One step, then another. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to see the rapid pulse in his throat, close enough to smell him properly for the first time, pine and iron and the clean, sharp scent of winter air, and beneath it something warm that made her wolf surge forward with a yearning so fierce it buckled her knees. Sable, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something sacred and something broken all at once. I know what this is, she whispered. I have known since the auction. Pain moved across his face. Then you know why it cannot happen. Because I am your property, she said, and the word tasted like ash. Because you did not choose this, he corrected, his voice cracking at the edges. You were sold to me. You were dragged to my compound in ropes. Whatever this bond is, whatever my wolf recognizes in you, it does not erase the fact that you are here because I bought you, not because you wanted to be. The truth of it settled over her like cold water. He was right. She hated that he was right. I am going to do something, he said, and you are going to be angry with me. He reached into the desk drawer and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. He held it out to her. It was a writ of release. Her name, her description, the seal of the Valdrin pack, and beneath it, in Theron's sharp, angular handwriting, the words, "Released from all bonds of service, free to leave the Valdrin territory at her discretion, effective immediately." The paper shook in her hands. "You are free," Theron said quietly. "You can leave tonight if you wish. Dashiell will provide an escort, supplies, silver enough to establish yourself wherever you choose." He swallowed. "You owe me nothing. You owe this pack nothing." Sable stared at the document. The letters blurred as her eyes filled. Freedom. Not since childhood had she been free. 13 years of ropes and auction blocks, and the man who owned her was handing her the key to the cage and telling her to fly. And the cruelest part, the part that made her want to scream, was that he was doing it because he loved her. Because his wolf had chosen her, and he would rather lose her than keep her in chains. She looked up at him. Tears streaked her face. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the devastation beneath it, the hairline fractures spreading through the stone. "And if I stay?" she whispered. His composure cracked. Just for a moment, a flash of desperate, agonized hope that he buried almost instantly. "Then you stay as a free woman," he said. "Not as my servant, not as my anything. You stay because you choose to, or you do not stay at all." Sable folded the writ of release carefully and pressed it against her heart. "I need time," she said, "to think." He nodded once and turned back to the window. She left his chambers with the paper clutched to her and her wolf keening inside her, and she did not know whether the sound was grief or joy. She could not think. That was the problem. Every rational thought she tried to assemble collapsed under the weight of the pull toward a man she had known for 3 weeks and understood with a depth that defied logic. Sable sat on her cot with the writ of release spread across her knees and tried to make a decision. She was free. For the first time since childhood, no one owned her. She could walk out the gate, take the silver Theron had offered, and disappear into whatever life she chose. She could go south, to the coastal settlements where packless wolves found work on the docks and in the fisheries. She could go east, to the independent territories where no alpha held sway. She could go anywhere, be anything. The thought made her feel like she was being hollowed out with a spoon. She went to Brennick at dawn. The old healer was already in his workshop, measuring dried foxglove into glass vials with the precision of a man performing surgery. He did not look up when she entered. "He freed you," Brennick said. "How did you know?" "Because it is what he would do. The man fights wars for strangers and frees the woman his wolf chose as mate, rather than let her remain in a cage. He is nobility distilled to its most impractical form. Sable sank into the stool across from him. I do not know what to do. Yes, you do. You are simply afraid to do it. I have been property since I was a child, Sable said, and her voice cracked in a way she had not allowed it to in years. I do not know how to want things for myself. I do not know how to choose. Every choice has been made for me. Every meal, every bed, every master. And now someone hands me freedom and a bond in the same breath and asks me to decide. And I do not have the machinery for it. The machinery was never built. Brennick stood, crossed to the shelf behind his workbench, and pulled down a clay pot. He set it in front of her. Silver vein, he said. You have been cutting it for me every morning since you arrived. Do you know why I let you? Because on your first day, you picked up the shears and cut the stalks at exactly the right angle without being told. You knew the plant. You knew where to cut, how much to take, how to preserve the root system for regrowth. He tapped the rim. That is not obedience. That is knowledge. Something that belongs to you. Something no one gave you and no one can take away. His eyes softened, the first time she had ever seen warmth in them. You say the machinery was never built. But you have been making choices your entire life. Small ones, quiet ones. The kind that kept you alive and sane through years of hardship. You chose to learn herbcraft. You chose to keep your wolf hidden instead of letting it be broken. You chose to stitch a wounded alpha instead of cowering in the corner. He leaned forward. You have always had the machinery, child. You have simply never been given permission to use it. Sable stared at him. Something cracked open inside her, not painfully, but with the aching release of a joint that had been locked too long. So use it, Brennick said quietly. What do you want? She knew the answer. She had known it since the moment Theron's confession had fallen out of his mouth like blood from a wound, raw and involuntary and true. She wanted to stay, not because she was told to, not because a wall stood between them and proximity was convenient. She wanted to stay because when she closed her eyes, the only future she could imagine that did not feel like slow suffocation was one where she chose him back. Sable left the workshop and walked straight to the Alpha's study. Deshelle stood outside the door. When he saw her coming, something shifted in his face. Not surprise, anticipation. Is he in there? Sable asked. He has not come out since last night, Dashel said. He has not slept. Of course he had not slept. She had been on the other side of the wall, awake and agonizing, and whatever tether connected them had kept him from rest, just as it had kept her from peace. Let me in, she said. Dashel studied her for a moment. Then he stepped aside and opened the door. The study was dim, the fire burned to embers. Theron sat behind his desk, but he was not working. His hands were flat on the surface, his head bowed, his eyes closed. He looked like a man in prayer, or a man at the end of his endurance. He knew she was there before she spoke. She saw it in the way his shoulders drew tight, the way his breathing hitched. I am not leaving, Sable said. He did not move. I read your writ 6 times, she continued, stepping closer, and I sat with it for hours, and I tried to imagine walking out of your gate with your silver in my pocket and your scent still on my skin, and I could not do it. Not because I am bound to you, not because I owe you, but because for the first time in my life, I want something that was not chosen for me, and it is you. His head lifted. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw. Your wolf, he repeated, and the word came out fractured, like it contained too much weight for a single syllable. She is awake, Sable said, because of you. The sound he made was not quite human. Low and anguished and full of a longing so vast it filled the room. He rose from the chair, and the movement brought them face to face across the narrow desk, inches apart, the air between them charged and trembling. "If you stay," he said, "I will not be able to keep my distance. I have been holding my wolf back for weeks, and it is killing me, Sable. Every night through that wall is a war I am losing." "Then stop fighting." He reached across the desk and took her face in both hands. His palms were warm and rough and shaking. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, and they stood there, breathing each other in, the bond between them thrumming so loudly she could feel it in her teeth. "I need you to be sure," he whispered. "I am sure." He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was desperate and starving, and every cage she had ever been locked inside, and 5 months of sleepless torment and 3 weeks of agony compressed into a single point of contact. His hands tangled in her hair, and Sable grabbed the front of his shirt and held on because the ground had disappeared beneath her feet, and he was the only solid thing left. They broke apart, gasping. His forehead pressed against hers again, his breath ragged. "Stay," he said. And the word was a plea and a prayer and a surrender all at once. "I am staying," she whispered. That night, for the first time, there was no wall between them. Sable sat beside him in his chambers, her back resting against the headboard, his heartbeat steady against her shoulder as he leaned into her. The pull had settled into something warm and constant, a low hum of rightness that smoothed every jagged edge inside her. He fell asleep beside her. She felt the exact moment sleep took him, the way his breath deepened, the way the tension dissolved from his body. She sat there in the quiet, beside the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, and felt something she had not felt since she was a child. Safe. She closed her eyes. Sleep pulled her under, and she woke somewhere that was not his chambers. The ground was wrong. It yielded beneath her bare feet like wet clay, soft and giving in a way that made her stomach turn. The air was thick with the smell of char and copper, and above her, the sky was a flat, featureless gray that pressed down like a ceiling made of ash. Sable turned in a slow circle. The landscape stretched in every direction without variation, a vast, colorless plain broken only by shapes she could not quite resolve in the distance. Dark shapes, still shapes, the kind of stillness that belonged to things that had stopped being alive a long time ago. "Theron," she called. Her voice came out thin, swallowed by the dead air. She found him 50 paces ahead, standing motionless. He was different here. The commanding presence, the physical authority that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, was gone. What stood before her was a man stripped to his most fundamental wound, shoulders bowed, hands hanging loose at his sides. "What is this place?" she whispered. "The field," he said. His voice was scraped clean of everything. "It is always the field." She followed his gaze, and her breath died in her throat. Bodies, hundreds of them, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Wolves and humans lying motionless in the mud. The silence was the worst part. The absolute suffocating absence of sound in a place that should have been full of life. "Every night," Theron said. "They are here. Every night they ask me the same question." As if summoned by his words, the bodies began to move. Not rising, not standing, but turning. Heads shifting in the mud, eyes finding him, mouths opening in unison. "Was it worth it?" they asked, and the chorus of voices was a single devastating whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere. Sable grabbed Theron's hand and squeezed. His grip was limp, passive, the grip of a man who had stopped resisting a long time ago. "This is the curse," she said. Not a question. "Neveska," he said. "The blood-seer of the Ashbourne settlement. She laid it as she died. Every night the dead call me back. Every night I answer." "You do not have to answer," Sable said fiercely. They died because of my orders, he replied, and the flatness in his voice was more frightening than any emotion would have been. Every one of them. The soldiers I sent, the civilians caught between, the wolves who fought because they had no choice. His gaze swept the field. I gave the order. They paid for it. The bodies whispered again. Was it worth it? Something cold slithered through the ground beneath her feet, climbing her ankles like vines, pulling at her. The curse recognized her. Already it was trying to root her here too. She wrenched her feet free. Theron, we need to leave. Now. You should not be here, he said, turning to her with sudden clarity breaking through. Fear flooded his features, sharp and real. Sable, you have to go. This place takes hold. If you stay too long, then we both leave. Together. Right now. I cannot leave, he said, and the certainty in his voice was devastating. I have tried. Every night, I have tried. The field does not release me until morning. The cold tendrils climbed higher. Sable grabbed Theron's face with both hands and forced him to look at her. Listen to me, she said. You ordered a march, because a warlord was slaughtering innocent people and refused every offer of peace. You fought a war that no one else would fight. People died, and that is monstrous, and you carry it, and you should carry it. But carrying it is not the same as lying down among them. Grief is not a debt you pay with your own destruction. His eyes searched hers. She could feel his wolf through the bond, enormous and wounded and desperately reaching for hers. And for the first time, her wolf answered. It rose inside her like a wave, breaking, sudden and immense and irresistible. 13 years of silence shattered in an instant, and the force of it sent a pulse of warmth through the bond that hit Theron like a physical blow. He staggered, gasped, and his hands came up to grip her wrists. Sable, he breathed, and this time her name sounded like an anchor. The cold tendrils recoiled. The bodies on the field went silent. The gray sky flickered like a candle flame caught in a draft. Come with me, Sable said, and she pulled. Not physically, something deeper. She pulled through the bond with everything she had, with the wolf that had been buried for 13 years and was now fully, ferociously awake, and she felt the curse strain and crack like ice over moving water. The field was gone. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart slamming. Theron was beside her, bolt upright, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For a moment neither spoke. Then his hand found hers in the tangled sheets, and his fingers locked around hers so tightly it hurt. You were there, he said, his voice wrecked. You were in the field. I was there, she confirmed, still shaking. You pulled me out. Disbelief and awe and terror mingled in his expression. No one has ever been able to pull me out. Sable looked at him in the dim light, at the tears tracking down his face, at the rawness in his eyes that he had never let anyone see. And she understood what Brennick had been trying to tell her. This was not proximity. This was not herbal residue or any clinical explanation. This was a bond, real and mutual and powerful enough to reach into a curse built on death and drag him back to the living. You are not going back there alone, she said. Never again. He pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs that he had been holding back for months. She wrapped her arms around him and held on and let him break, because some things had to break before they could be rebuilt. They stayed like that until dawn. Neither slept. But for the first time, Theron Valdrin was not alone in the dark, and the field did not call him back. Morning came like a pardon. Golden light crept across the stone floor, warming the tangled sheets. The two bodies still wound around each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of wreckage. Sable blinked awake slowly, her face pressed against Theron's chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. Calm. Present. She tilted her head and found him already awake, watching her with those smoke-colored eyes. The haunted quality that had lived behind his gaze since the moment she first saw him in the auction square had thinned, not vanished. You did not erase months of nightly torment in a single night. But the shadow had retreated, and what remained was something raw and new and cautiously hopeful. You did not go back, Sable said quietly. No. You slept. I slept. He said it like he was testing the words, like they might dissolve if he spoke them too loudly. His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, and the tenderness in the gesture was so at odds with everything she knew about his reputation that it made her throat tight. "How do you feel?" she asked. He considered the question with the gravity of a man being asked to assess a battlefield. "Like someone removed a blade I did not realize was lodged between my ribs." "It may come back," she said carefully. "The curse. The field. One night does not mean it is broken." "I know. But I will be there if it does." His arm tightened around her. "The writ of release," he said. "You still have it?" She nodded. It was folded inside the pocket of her dress, which lay crumpled on the floor beside the bed. "Good," he said. "Keep it. Always." She understood what he meant. No matter what happened between them, no matter how deep the bond grew, she would always have proof that she was free. That she had chosen this. That she could unchoose it. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was about a piece of paper. They went to Brennick together. The old healer had cleared his workbench, which was unprecedented, and set out 2 chairs. He sat with his hands folded and his expression arranged into the particular configuration of professional calm that healers wore when they were about to deliver complicated news. "The curse is not broken," Brennick said without preamble. "What happened last night was a disruption, not a cure." Sable reached for Theron's hand under the table and held it. "The curse is blood magic," Brennick continued, "laid by a dying seer with her last breath. That kind of working does not shatter because the target had one good night. It weakens, it fractures, but the root is still alive, and it will try to pull him back." His gaze shifted to Sable. "Your bond disrupted the curse because a mate bond operates on a frequency that blood magic cannot override. But the curse is adapting. It will find cracks. It will try again." "So what do we do?" Sable asked. "You complete the bond," Brennick said plainly. "Fully, formally, irreversibly. A half-formed connection disrupted the curse once, but it will not hold against a sustained assault. You need the full bond, the claiming, the marks, the joining of wolves. Once that is sealed, the curse will have no entry point. The bond becomes a closed circuit. Nothing gets in." The silence that followed was dense with implication. A full mating bond was not a casual thing. Permanent, irrevocable. 2 wolves bound at the deepest level of their being, their lives literally intertwined. If one died, the other followed. Theron withdrew his hand from hers. "No," he said. Sable turned to look at him. His jaw was set, the stone mask back in place. "If the bond is completed and I die," he said, addressing Brennick but speaking to her, "she dies. That is what a full bond means. I will not condemn her to that. If the bond is not completed, the curse will eventually overcome her disruption and kill you," Brennick replied, "and given the partial bond already forming between you, your death will likely kill her anyway, just more slowly and more painfully." "You do not get to make this decision for me," Sable said quietly. Theron looked at her, and she saw the war raging behind his eyes, the wolf that wanted her with a ferocity that shook the foundations of his control, and the man who would rather destroy himself than take away her choice. "You gave me a writ of release," she said. "You told me I stay because I choose to, or I do not stay at all. Those were your words." She held his gaze. "I am choosing. Right now. I choose the bond. I choose you. And if you refuse because you think you are protecting me, then you are doing exactly what every master before you did. You are deciding what is best for me without asking." The blow landed. She saw it hit, saw the flinch, saw the crack split through the granite. "She is right," Brennick said mildly. Theron stared at her for a long, suspended moment. Then something broke behind his eyes, not painfully, but like dawn breaking, slow and inevitable and full of light. "You are terrifying," he said softly. "You are stubborn," she replied. He leaned forward, took her face in his hands, and kissed her forehead with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. "Then we do this together," he whispered against her skin. The claiming ceremony was held that evening in the Great Hall, witnessed by Dachelle, Brennick, Marin, and the Elder Council. There were no flowers, no music, no borrowed finery. Sable wore her gray servant's dress because she wanted to remember where she had come from when she stood beside the man she had chosen. Theron marked her first. He pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, and the bond mark burned into place like a seal being set into warm wax. She felt the bond lock into place, golden and immense and permanent, flooding her with warmth and light, and the overwhelming, unmistakable presence of his wolf joining hers. She marked him back, her lips against his throat, her wolf surging forward to meet his, and the sound he made was not pain. Release. 5 months of curse and isolation and slow deterioration ended in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the bond sealed, the circuit closed. And somewhere in the dark, on a colorless plain that existed between sleep and death, the field went silent. The curse did not die quietly. For weeks after the claiming, Theron still dreamed of the field. He would wake in the small hours, rigid and breathing hard, the echo of whispered accusations fading in his ears. But he woke in Sable's arms, and her wolf was there to meet his, steady and fierce and impossibly bright, and the dreams retreated a little further each time. By the second month, the dreams came only once a week. By the third, they were fragments, gray wisps without form or voice that dissolved before dawn. Sable continued working in the herb workshop. Brennick refused to let her stop, and she refused to let him dismiss her, and their mutual stubbornness became the most stable relationship in the compound. She expanded his stores, reorganized his filing system for the first time in 40 years, and taught his new apprentice the correct angle for cutting silver vein so the root system survived. The pack adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular friction that accompanied anything unprecedented. A former servant as the alpha's mate. Whispers followed her through corridors, some admiring, some resentful, all curious. "They will adjust," Theron told her one evening, pulling her close in the privacy of their chambers. "And if they do not?" "Then they can take it up with their alpha," he said, who happens to be unreasonably devoted to his mate. Months passed. The compound softened around her. Marin brought her tea in the mornings without being asked. Dachelle started knocking before entering rooms she occupied, a courtesy he extended to no one else. And one afternoon, as she crossed the courtyard with an armful of dried chamomile, a young wolf she did not recognize stopped her and asked, shyly, if the alpha's mate might teach her how to make a healing salve. Sable looked at the girl, at her nervous hands and her hopeful expression, and felt something unlock inside her that had been sealed shut since she was a child. "Of course," she said. "Come with me." That night, Sable woke to stillness. No dreams, no field, no whispers. Just the warmth of Theron beside her, his arm draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even and peaceful. She lay there in the dark and listened to him sleep. The most feared alpha in the Northern Territories, undone by a woman who had been Lot 14, reduced to a price tag and a description on an auction block. Strong teeth, adequate health, good for household labor. She pressed her palm against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and sure, and smiled. She was none of those things. She was none of the things they had ever called her. She was his, and he was hers, and they were free.